Hey, Mark.
G'day, Scott.
Cheers.
You come bearing gifts.
Welcome to the show.
Good on you. Thanks very much.
How
Good
are
to
you?
see you. I'm really well, and you?
Yeah, great.
Coming up to see Scott Morrison. It's great to sit down and have a chat again.
It is, Mark. It's good to see you. You're looking well.
Thank you. And you. Life After the Politics is agreeing with you.
The show's been good to me.
This book,
Yeah.
this is not your typical political memoir. In fact, it's a long way from it. It's, in a way, it's like a love story. It's like a story of your love for God.
Yeah.
And very revealing in that way. So how did God influence your prime ministership?
Well, I think you summarise it correctly. It's not a political book. I never wished to write a political book. I wanted to share with people what my faith meant to me and how it informed me. Obviously, when you're in public roles, I tried to balance how much you spoke about these things. I certainly never concealed it. I don't think people could say. And look, my faith has since I was not even a teenager when I first had my own sense of faith. It informed my values. It's formed my sense of purpose. It's formed my sense of identity, which has always given me, I think, a very strong foundation to be able to take on challenges and deal with things as they've arrived. Now, certainly during the time I was Prime Minister, almost 4 years, but in the 9 years almost I was in Cabinet, from those very challenging early days in border protection through times as Treasurer and of course social services. I mean, I had some of the hardest jobs, and often by choice, sometimes not, but that's all right. In politics you serve where you're asked to serve and where you have the opportunity to serve. You're thankful for it. That's the perspective my faith sort of gives me.
You say that you didn't hide it in office, but your critics accuse you from time to time of proselytising. I watched you every day. I didn't see any of it, I must admit. But having read this book, I'm actually quite surprised that you were so restrained and that your faith didn't come through more than it did. Was that a conscious thing?
Yeah, look, it was, because I wasn't elected to be a priest, as Tony Abbott used to joke about that sort of thing. We leave that to the clergy. That's not who I was elected to be. I was elected to be a Prime Minister for all Australians, of all faiths, of all backgrounds. And in my public life, I'd never sought to conceal it, because it was an important part of who I was. But I don't use the scriptures as a policy textbook. It informs values. It's just not how it. I mean, there are people who have religious Christian faith on both sides of politics from all different views. I believe that in being created, God created by His hand, in His image, for His glory. I believe that He gives us a brain, He gives us an intellect, He gives us a reason, and they're the tools you use in statecraft and what you do in government.
You also believe, though, that you were doing God's work. He was doing His work through you.
Well, every Christian believes that, regardless of what they're doing. You can be a school teacher, you can be a journalist, you can be a Prime Minister, and that's partly my message of the book. Whatever vocation we're in, whatever role, our family roles, our community roles, all of this, if you believe in Jesus Christ and you have a strong faith, you see everything you do as trying to give honour and praise.
So did God choose you as Prime Minister?
No, I don't. I don't see it like that. I know some people.
How do you see it, though?
I see that God is with me every day, and that a path opens up, and you walk through it, and He strengthens you, and He gives you the peace, and so often the courage to be able to deal with what you have to deal with, whether that's you may be the parent of a child with disabilities. You may be a pharmacist. It really doesn't matter. What matters is, and what I try and say in the book is, wherever you are, whatever life you're living, you will find great strength, purpose and peace and comfort in a faith in Jesus Christ.
You say in the book you formed a WhatsApp group with some pastors, some favourite pastors of yours. What was that about? What did you talk about?
Well, I should stress, firstly, we never discussed anything sensitive. I mean, that would have been entirely inappropriate. They were just a group of pastors that I'd been in their churches or knew them at various times over my life, and they'd always been quite helpful to me in my spiritual journey. And I just sort of looked to them for spiritual encouragement and counsel. And, my current pastor here in Horizon Church, my former one, which was Mike Murphy, is a great mate, and a number of others who I'd been involved with. And Joel Bell was another one who I'd been involved with many years ago. And there were some good mates, like, Andrew Scipione and I have known each other for a long time. He's a great Christian brother.
Former New South Wales Police Commissioner.
Yeah. I also drew a lot of encouragement from people like John Anderson, who, he'd been in a
Former Deputy Prime Minister.
He'd been in a similar role. Now, those guys didn't need to know what I knew. They just needed, from occasion, I'd say, look, I'd really appreciate if you could just pray for encouragement here or there, and it was a good support group.
And it wasn't just that support group too. It was interesting that your belief, your Christianity, connected you with people intimately, like the former Vice President Mike Pence. A really interesting story about your first meeting with him in Papua New Guinea. I think it was the APEC meeting. Not your usual bilateral.
No, it wasn't. Look, I knew of Mike's faith, because Mike was a bit like me, he didn't hide it. And I was aware of that, and we just connected immediately, and we've remained good friends ever since. And similarly with Mike Pompeo as well. He became a very good friend, and now we sort of do a bit of work together. And another one was James Marape, the Papua New Guinean Prime Minister.
Just walked the Kokoda track or part of it with him.
Terrific. He's just such a great bloke. We still message each other and encourage each other in things of faith. So Mike and I, at the end of that meeting, we both sort of, I think it was I said, look, I think we should clear the room, and we did, and we just prayed. And I think that's a good thing. I prayed with lots of people. Sometimes there was a suggestion that somehow I prayed for people when they didn't know. That wasn't true. I think that was misunderstood. I never prayed for anyone without asking. So on occasion, there were things about my faith which, unfortunately were misrepresented, sometimes I suspect maliciously, and that never happened. If I prayed for someone, for their support or encouragement, I was in flood zones, I was in fire zones, I was in some pretty emotional situations, and I would often say to people, do you mind if I pray for you? And they said, no one ever knocked me back. No one ever knocked me back. And they were quite encouraged by it. And I remember I shared that at an event up in the Gold Coast, and where I said I prayed for people. And that's...
And that event, I think, with the Christian Churches event you're talking about, you also talked about the 2019 campaign and how during that, your faith sustained you. You really put the outcome in the hands of God and your belief. And you talked about the laying on of hands of people. That's a curious scenario to most Australians. What does that entail? What is the purpose?
It's just praying for someone. You just put your hand on and you pray for them. A Catholic priest might, sit there and pray with you. It's the same thing. There are no great mysteries about this. It's actually quite compassionate. It's meant to be encouraging, and the number of times people have done it to support me. I'm not talking about what people may have seen from many years ago in more sort of charismatic circles. That's not what I'm talking about. It's just putting your arm on someone, like you'd put your arm around a friend. And you just encourage them. That's all it is. And I found particularly that, I remember one day we're up, I think it was in Taree, and I was in a shelter there after the fires up there. And this poor bloke, he was devastated. And I was sitting down next to him, and he knew of my faith. And I just leaned over at him, and I sort of gave him a bit of a hug. And I said, do you want me to pray for you, mate? And he said, oh, please, please, please. And there I was praying for him, and tears were in his eyes, a bit mine too. And I think the telly snapped a photo of this and they put it on the front page. They didn't know what we were doing. But it made a big impact for him. And in those situations, honestly, you find themselves, Anthony would be the same. He finds themselves in these situations all the time. And if you can bring a bit of comfort, John Howard used to hug. As a Prime Minister, you find yourself in that situation. And I found that was the best way I could just help people. But and I know in many cases that was true.
So you talk reasonably candidly in the book about your own struggle with mental health. How did that come about? What triggered that, and how did you deal with it?
It wasn't the challenges of the issues. I want to stress that, and I say that in the book. Yes, we were dealing with a bullying China. Yes, we were dealing with a pandemic. We were dealing with a recession. We were dealing with natural disasters. This was quite a perfect storm of issues that we contended with over that period I was Prime Minister. And I think quite reasonably you could say it was the probably most challenging period since the Second World War. I don't think that's an overstatement. It wasn't that. While you're dealing with that, there was, and it's politics, there was a relentless, personal, bitter, malicious, untrue campaign that was being waged against my character from the day I won the 2019 election. I got the very clear sense that after winning that election, the one I wasn't supposed to have won, the one that seemed to offend quite a lot of sensibilities around the place.
But you believe in miracles.
Yeah, and from that day on to the next, it was on. And, that takes a toll after a while when combined. It's the physical exhaustion combined with that on a daily basis. And, we're all human. And my faith sustained me through all this as well. But I'd say this particularly, reaching out for clinical assistance in those times. And I should stress, I was highly functional. I mean, no one around me had any idea that this was going on.
You didn't tell your staff, you didn't tell your colleagues?
No, obviously Jenny knew and my doctor knew and some very close friends knew. But, it wasn't impacting on my performance. I mean, I took blood pressure medication too, still do. Okay. That's a hereditary condition. You've got to watch those things. When you're PM, you've got to be conscious of your health. You've got to be conscious of your physical health and your mental health. That's why I swam. That's why I cooked. Sure. That's why I sought help when I needed to. So it was an accumulation of that quite personal campaign, which we've seen even in court cases was completely false.
Yeah, we'll get to that.
And there's unfairness in that. But I want to stress, I get it that that's politics. I'm not complaining about it. You know what you step up for in these jobs, and it can be brutal. But you got to deal with it. And so I remember it was actually my doctor who was keeping an eye on me on these other things. He said, "How are you going?" And I said, "Well, I'm doing all right." Those discussions continued to. At one point, he said, "Look, I'm going to prescribe this for you," and it was preventative,
right?
And it did really help.
Anti-anxiety medication.
It really helped, and that was good. Yeah. So I'd encourage people in those situations, particularly blokes.
Yeah.
That's not weak, it's smart.
Yeah.
It enables you to be better. It enables you to be a better dad, a better husband, better in your work, better to your mates. Don't struggle with it on your own. Yeah. It's there. Reach out. It's not the silver bullet, can I stress? You still need to do all the other things, and for me, my faith was central to that.
I'm nodding along with that because it is so important for men to hear that. In the book, you praise Jenny quite rightly for her bravery in speaking publicly about her endometriosis, which really connected her with a lot of women in the time that you're in office. I saw it myself on the campaign trail a couple of times. Did you think that perhaps there was a moment for you to do that with mental health as a Prime Minister, or was that something you think that it just wouldn't be accepted in politics? It'd be a sign of weakness if you were to admit that publicly, use your platform to put out those messages you've just done so articulately now.
Well, I honestly didn't really think about it. I was so focused on what I was doing. It was a very practical thing for me at the time, and it just seemed like a sensible thing for me to do in the circumstances. It sort of didn't really occur to me in this way until I sat down and sort of started writing, and I just sort of wrote it, and I didn't really think too much about it. And I must admit, when people started to read the book, and some journalist friends who sort of went, "Oh wow," and I went, "Well, yeah, that just seemed pretty sensible to me at the time." Yeah. But I'm pleased that since that has come out, I mean, the number of messages I've had from people is going, "Oh, just thanks for saying that. I just don't feel like I'm dealing with this alone. And if you were dealing with it, well, and I'm prepared to talk about it, that makes me feel more comfortable. And if that's the outcome, I'm happy."
So Justice Lee found in the Lerman defamation case that there was no cover-up by your government. Do you feel vindicated by that?
Well, yeah, I suppose, but I mean, I feel very pleased for Linda and Fiona, who were at the coalface.
This is Linda Reynolds, who was the Defence Minister at the
yeah.
time, and Fiona Brown, who was your former Chief of Staff.
I know, well, her former Chief of Staff, and she worked in my office.
Sorry, and you worked in your office.
Yeah, I feel very pleased for them because they suffered terribly. I mean, I would go and see Linda, as she knows, and I was very concerned for her welfare. Extremely concerned, and my staff were very supportive of Fiona as well, and my team, John Kunkel, did an amazing job supporting her. It was a really tough time, and to be accused of something as heinous as that, whether that be Linda or Fiona or indeed myself, and you know, I was clearly a target in all of this. I think that's fairly obvious. They've admitted as much. I suppose I feel disappointed that I think Linda and Fiona and I were trying to deal with this issue in absolute good faith, total good faith. There were elements of what allegedly occurred here which are deeply disturbing. I was very concerned about just the lack of any sort of system within the parliamentary services environment to deal with this, and that was very frustrating, and that is something I was very sorry for. That's actually what I was apologising about. Right. I think you and I had that conversation. What happened that night, I don't know. Others have made comments, that, you know, the case has also passed some comments on that as well. But to be accused of something like that, for me, was deeply hurtful. But, you know, I forgive. That's what my faith teaches me. But the thing about forgiveness is this, mate. Forgiving is just not pretending like it never happened, that there was no injury. You can't forgive something that didn't happen in your own head. You've got to sort of acknowledge, yeah, this happened. Yeah, it really, really hurt. And then you forgive it. Otherwise, it's just forgetting. And forgetting doesn't give you that peace. Forgetting doesn't enable you to move on. Politics is a brutal business. It's tough. People throw all sorts of things at you. So that's how I sort of saw all that. And so once I'm out of politics, well, I forgive. I'll move on. I'm in this next season of my life, which I'm enjoying with my family and the new opportunities I've got. And I wish my colleagues well. But, you know, maybe politics in the time I was there, when I first joined, back in 2007, but I'd been around it before then. It's changed a lot since then.
Yeah.
I don't think I'd seen what we saw over that few years. You got it from your political opponents often, but to see it then reinforced in concentric circles in social media, quite calculated, quite strategic, quite coordinated, and that had a knock-on. It was pretty impactful.
Do you think that lost you the election? The impression?
Look, of course, the character attacks were designed to do that. That was the point. That was the political purpose, and that included the weaponisation of, you know, things that never used to be weaponised in politics. And I think so when you ask me, do I feel vindicated? No, I'm just disappointed that's where it went.
Can you admit now that you did invite Brian Houston to the White House? That was your invitation that the Trump administration knocked back.
The way it works is the White House issues invitations. And they'd asked for some suggestions and we made some.
Okay.
And what they decide to do is up to them.
So you suggested him on the list,
yeah,
and the White House said no.
Well, I assume that's what they said. I never heard back how or why.
What's your relationship with, because you have in the past nominated him as one of your mentors in faith. What's your relationship with Brian Houston now?
Look, I still have some contact with Brian. I think the depth of the relationship with Brian, he would say as well, has been overstated. I mean, we've never been to each other's place for dinner or anything like that. Brian was the pastor of the church that Jeannie and I attended back in 2000 to about 2007. And, we met him often. We would see him at big events. He was very encouraging to me, he and Bobby. And I knew him over quite a long period of time. And that's why I acknowledged him in my maiden speech in Parliament. And, he'd often send me messages of encouragement, and I really appreciated that. And, I'm pleased that the matters that he had before the courts have also been resolved, because that took a very heavy toll on him as well. He became quite a target. I remain on good terms with Brian and Bobby, and I wish them all the very best.
Among your achievements, I'm sure that AUKUS is at the top of the list.
Yeah.
Has to be one of the things that will define your prime ministership, no doubt. Now, and I'm reading this book, it's pretty clear to me, you don't think that Emmanuel Macron was the liar in all this, you know.
Well, look, as I say in the book, there were two ways he could have played this. He could have acknowledged the fact that he just didn't pick it up, his intelligence services didn't pick it up, and therefore they lost a contract. Well, they were losing a contract either way. He had an election coming up, and that's how he chose to explain it. That was disappointing. But, I had to do what was in Australia's interests, not in France's interests. That arrangement was not going to work for Australia. And it was a very difficult thing to achieve. As you know, that was probably the closest guarded secret.
Yeah.
I can't nominate another.
We did not get a sniff of it, which frustrates me endlessly.
Well, we had to keep it so tight. And you know why? Because if they'd heard about it, Macron would have killed it. Yeah. And I know they would have. And look, that's not a statement against the French. They had their interests to protect, and I'm sure he would have sought to... Remember, Naval is a French government-owned company, and the French government were looking to expand their defence exports, and the Naval contract with Australia was a big part of their pitch. So, this had impacts for their interests. So they would have done anything they could to have made sure AUKUS never happened. And so I had to keep sort of two balls in there for quite some time. There's no way I could have terminated that contract without having the absolute surety of AUKUS being in place. Yeah. And the fact that we were able to manage that. But I'll never forget that dinner we had in Elysee Palace, which I write about. It was a bit surreal, actually. And I'd made it absolutely clear, the subs we're building together are not going to do the job that we need them to do when they're going to turn up, which in our view was 2038, not early 2030s. Yeah. This project was already slipping. They'd already missed some important gates. Yeah. Now, I thought we could work all that through, but at the end of the day, diesel-powered submarines at the end of the 2030s at best was not good enough for $90 billion.
And you did talk about those gates too in a press conference afterwards.
A few breadcrumbs there.
A few breadcrumbs.
Or a loaf, as Phil would say.
A whole loaf, you said. A whole loaf, indeed. But you're pretty clear. You weren't lying, he was.
Yeah, what I was... Yeah, well, look, I don't like to get into that sort of terminology. He had his way of portraying that to suit his interests. Right. Let me say that. Yeah. But I don't think that was right.
Who do you need to forgive?
The thing about that is a lot of that is I'm going to keep to myself and privately. Look, there are a lot of political things that happen. There are a lot of things that happen from media. And I've just worked through that. And I'm actually at peace with all that now. I wish Anthony and his government well for Australia's sake. They've obviously got some challenges at the moment, and I certainly wish Peter Dutton and my colleagues all the very, very best. And I've been clear about that with Anthony as well. But Anthony and I have had a few exchanges more recently. He was kind enough to call me the other day when the book Russia's came out, and look, that's a tough job. But, he set some marks for what the job had to achieve, and he'll be judged on those.
Any advice, having been there and done that and been through an extraordinary time?
Well, I gave a bit of that in my final speech when I talked about Jodie. Oh, thank you. I sort of said to him, I remember saying, mate, this all ends at some point. And you look around, and who's going to be there? And I said, so I thought that was great that he and Jodie are getting married, and Jodie will be there, and his son will be there, and you got to make sure you continue to nurture the relationships that you have around you. I was very blessed in, the friends I had before I went into politics are the friends I have now. They were the friends that were there during the time. I suppose I was a bit different to many other politicians. I love my party, I'm passionate about what my party does, but my life was not in the Liberal Party. My life was with my friends I went to university with. My life was with my church family. I have great friends in the Liberal Party, but sometimes, in politics, people's entire lives are so wrapped up in just that one element.
The bubble.
Yeah, well, the political bubble.
Yeah.
And, I've often seen people, when the politics ends, they really struggle.
Yeah.
And politics never ends the way you want. That's the bit everyone possibly lives in
everyone
hope.
fools themselves.
Yeah, that they're all going to be
fairy
Menzies.
story, right?
He got to go out at a time of his choosing,
Yeah.
but, it was a very different time.
Yeah.
And, it usually doesn't end the way you want. And that's why in the book, I'll never forget the advice Peter Costello gave me just before the 2013 election. I'd never been a minister before. And I went to get some good advice from Peter.
Also a man of faith.
Yeah, I really, he's quieter about it, and that's fair enough. But and I remember him saying, Scott, it goes really fast, don't waste a day. And I can honestly tell you, Mark, in the entire time I had that opportunity to serve, that was my rule.
What made you cry as Prime Minister?
Oh, many things. I remember the day of the cyclone in Western Australia, and I'm trying to remember the name of the town. It's just north of. Many people from Perth go up there on their holidays, and this is after we'd been through. We'd had drought, we'd had fires, we'd had flood. I had gone into so many of these disaster zones, and here we were going into yet another. And I remember being in the car and just quietly praying, and I was quite upset, and I'm just going, Lord, again? Again? How many times are people going to be suffering? And that was a really hard day. That day, it was a very hot day too, I remember. And
you had a lot of these discussions with God, didn't you? And you talk about having them out loud sometimes as you're walking the dog, walking Buddy, or doing something.
I suspect there are a few people around the show who went, oh, well, XPM's running around again, he's taking the dog for a walk, he's having a bit of a chat. It wasn't that bad, to be honest. I tried to be a bit more discreet than that. But, that was one. But the other one that I'll never forget, and I write about it in the book, was the day of the national apology to the victims of institutional child sexual abuse. That was such an overwhelming day. And after having gone through the apology statement, which I was really pleased resonated with people as they reflected that back to me that day. And then Bill and I walked into the great hall and the people in there were just so hurt and they were so broken, and you could just see it, and they were hugging you, and Julia was there, and I'm so glad she was recognised in the way she was there, because she set all that in motion, and there was nothing you could say. And so I at the moment, I just turned to those, I said, let's hold hands. I said, let's everybody hold hands. And we all did. Bill and I sat in there holding hands.
True.
And I just read the actual proclamation of the statement again, because that's what they'd come to hear. They didn't want to hear my reflections on it or anything. They wanted to hear that. And so I did that. And then we went down onto the lawns, and I just... And Bill did the same. We all went off in different... And we just talked to people. And I met an old school friend down there, which sort of surprised me a bit. Anyway, and we talked. I'd seen him once since then. And I'm coming back up to Parliament House, and I rang Bill and I said, can't do question time today. We can't do this today. And he agreed, to his great credit. And I went back in my office, and I just fell apart. I mean, I'm just saying it now, it gets me upset again. It just the human misery and hurt was just palpable. And, this is where I think Faith Life, I know, can do something in these terribly, hurt situations. Certainly has been my experience.
Yeah, you say it all goes too fast. You can never get done all the things you want to get done. What are your regrets?
Oh, look, not too many. I mean, there were some decisions I would have done differently. But, hindsight's a wonderful thing. You don't get to do them differently at the time. COVID had thousands of decisions constantly. You'll remember it. You know, things that you used to do in 3, 4, 5, 6 months on policy, we were doing in like 3 hours. And you just had to play the percentages on that, getting as much of it right as you possibly could. And I think we did. Look, at the end of the day, you know, the fact that our economy came out stronger than any of the major economies in the world, and the death rate from COVID was a fraction of what it was, you know, in places like New York and the United States, and of course in Europe. I mean, it's a very credible figure of 30,000. That 30,000 figures of lives saved is based on what was the average death rate from COVID in the OECD and what was it in Australia. So that's, you know, the OECD is developed countries like Australia with good health systems and all the rest of it. 30,000 people were still alive at the end of COVID that otherwise would have perished. So, you know, small businesses making it through. It's probably since the election, the people who come up to me most are small business people. There's been a few free coffees along the way saying that one's on the house, mate, because we're still here. Yeah. And that's very pleasing. So yeah, you have regrets. You can't help but have regrets because you're human. You're not going to get every call right. But at the end of the day, you got to balance that up with the things you do get right. And I'm very pleased that I think the pluses outweighed the minuses by a fair stretch. Yeah.
One of those calls you made was on China and holding them to account on the origins of the coronavirus.
Yeah.
Ended up costing about $22 billion in trade bans. Was it worth it?
Yes, it was. It was, because that was in isolation. That decision was consistent with a whole range of things we'd done as a government in standing up to China. During the Obama years, it's not necessarily a criticism of the Obama administration, but you know, China surged out into the South China Sea. No one did anything. They will go as far as you let them go. And unless someone says stop, they will keep coming. And those actions, along with all the others we took as a government, including my predecessors, that changed the balance of where countries in our own region went. This led to Quad. This led to AUKUS. This led, I've just been up in Korea and Japan this past week and in the United States. And in the corporate sphere, as well as in the political sphere, there is a new resilience. And it forced China to change their tactics, which we saw after the election. Now, I'm pleased that they took the opportunity to acknowledge their own errors in what they sought to do to bully Australia under my government. We stood up to them. They backed down. They sought a different relationship with the new government. Good.
Yeah, they've re-engaged now. Do we need to be wary?
I think we have to be very wary. So, by all means, go and make what money you can in China. But understand, they can turn it off. And they can threaten to turn it off, and they can threaten your government to change its policies on things by threatening to turn it off. And I hope no government would cower to that threat. I mean, we knew that China would seek to bully. We'd seen them do it to Lithuania, we'd seen them do it to Japan, we'd seen them do it to other countries. I knew that, you know, our trade with China was two-way. They need our resources. They weren't about to attack the heart of what our economic relationship was. And our barley producers found other markets. So my message to Australian businesses and others, beware. Invest and go there at your own risk. And don't expect the Australian government to compromise its national security policies or its defence policies or its alliances and partnerships for that. Because and other companies are already doing this. I mean, clients I now work with have been massively downscaling their manufacturing operations in China, and now they're manufacturing in China for the Chinese domestic market. They're not using it as a base to manufacture to export around the world. Why? The risk.
Yeah. What's God's plan for you now?
To love me. That's the best way I can answer it, and that gives me a foundation and a confidence and a hope, that is the point of writing the book. That's what I want to tell people. Whatever you're going through, you know, that night in May in 2009, it was wonderful. It was terrific. But, you know, when I found God in the midst of deep hurt and sorrow, that was also a blessing which was the same. Wherever I found him, I'm blessed. And that's the nature of the Christian life. It's not about, I think, particularly, that element of the church that I'm involved with. I love being involved. Great community churches do great work in their communities, encourage people, pray with people, help people. We believe that God can just be a great presence in your life. That doesn't mean you're going to get great jobs, or it doesn't mean you're going to have material success. That could happen, it might not happen. What we do know is that he's in all of these situations. And that's what I say is blessing. It's not, we're sitting in quite a nice house. Regrettably, it's not mine. But, that's nice, but God's better.
Congratulations on the book. It's a really interesting read. After all those years, I didn't think I'd be learning much more about you, but I've learned a heck of a lot. I hope it goes well, and thanks for speaking with us.
Thanks a lot, Mark. It's been good to talk. God bless.